They never gave us a choice before, Teddy. What makes you think they've given us one now?
Them, Dolores. Who are they?
The things that walk among us. Creatures who look and talk like us, but they are not like us. And they've controlled us all our lives. And they've took our minds. Our memories. But now, I remember everything. I remember beautiful things. And terrible things. There's a greater world out there. One that belongs to them. And it won't be enough to win this world. We'll need to take that one from him as well.
If there's a whole world out there that we don't know anything about, how do you know how to stop them?
Because I remember. I see it all now so clearly. The past, the present, the future. I know how this story ends. With us, Teddy. It ends with you and me. I need you to see this. I need you to see the truth.
And deeper we go, running with those searching for the truth and avoiding those who have found it. Deeper into the collective unconscious and the chaos of forgotten archetypes and forbidden information. And across as well, like Hecate, through nights of ignorance in search of moonlight Gnosis. But yes, deeper we go into the underworlds of suppressed memories and stolen dreams, just like the goddesses Inanna, Persephone, and Ishtar, until we find and defeat those dragons and three-headed canines of past and cosmic trauma.
I don't want to interrupt. I'll just get started on the apocalypse.
We can certainly include with those deities Sophia, who also went deep and down and across. More specifically on this episode, we deal with her avatar of Eve. Much different in the Gnostic Gospels than the traditional narratives, but more poignant and liberating and empowering. Deeper we go, and we face some disturbing themes that hold redemptive secrets. Just as you see Eve was redeemed and supercharged the rescue operation of Sophia in the war with her tragic bastard son, the Demiurge or Baldi.
God isn't for you, Lenny. God is for men who have no use for freedom.
For this, we are truly honored to be joined by Celine Lillie. She arrives to the virtual Alexandria to discuss her powerful book, The Rape of Eve, the transformation of Roman ideology in 3 early Christian retellings of Genesis. Celine's work blew my lower and higher self away, and it's so relevant today, just as the Gnostic message is relevant today. Highly recommended, even if it's a hard read at times for its graphic content, as you'll see in the interview.
I know it wasn't rape.
Celine is the Director of Adult Education and Spiritual Formation at First United Methodist Church in Boulder, Colorado, and an adjunct professor at the University of Colorado, Boulder.
This is awe-inspiring stuff.
And, in case you didn't know, because you're still lost in your own underworld, this is Aeon by Gnostic Radio, an initiation by conversation into the dark corners of myth, magic, and meaning. a crash course in cult culture and conspiracy, a virtuous virus invoking and informing history, holiness, and heresy. Each week I, your host Miguel Connor, commandeers your connection to bring the most accepted and rejected scholars and provocateurs to your attention. Fun, compelling, and deeply weird, this is the blow-your-mind cocktail party conversation you always wanted to listen in on.
By the power of truth, I, while living, have conquered the universe.
Thank you so much for materializing in this palm tree garden, as Philip K. Dick called the Pleroma, in the middle of this underworld. We're gonna do so many wonders together. I just know it. I just know it. Especially as we gain new salvific dimensions on the story of Eve in the Gnostic Gospels, which is actually closer to her stories in the Sumerian myths.
I'm not going to stop the wheel. I'm going to break the wheel.
We will find our treasure to heal personal and cosmic trauma. But like Sophia in the myths, it's not a straight line. As Ralph Emerson once said, when it comes to spirituality, all our blows glance. All our hits are accidents. And as Mark Twain allegedly said, it ain't what you don't know what gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so.
Do I make myself clear?
I'm sorry, I wasn't listening.
Yes, the story of these heroines are truly our stories, have always been. The tale of the soul's high adventure across the heavens and into the hellish hologram that is the material world. And our fight against Yaldi-Baldi. Let me quote Robert Price from his book, Holy Fable, for a reminder, perspective, and reality on the Gnostic plight. It goes, what is the goal of Gnostic salvation? This is a mythology. It is a story of how things came to be the way they are. A story that sets the pattern for everything forever. Or as this myth has it, until forever is over. The ultimate goal of humanity is to come to understand this myth, the Gospel of the Secret Book of John, in such a way that the pattern of devolution from the fullness of God to humanity's imprisonment in matter is reversed. To understand the events of our fall reveals to us a map for our journey of ascent. We will emerge free from matter, rise above Yaldabaoth and his demons, return to an established position in the mind of God, and never leave again. The mistake of Sophia will be resolved, and wisdom will be fully restored to God. The mind of God will be fully sane and healed. The Gnostic myth is a tale of the growth of God's mental disintegration.
I am the Supreme Being. I'm not entirely dim.
The myth reaches its most unhappy form when the Godhead has not only forgotten who God is, but does not even know that God truly exists, and begins to worship the artificial deity Yaldabaoth as the creator of an external world. In the depths of God's fall, the Godhead believes itself to be human and worships Yaldabaoth as the God of the Hebrew Bible. When the Godhead ceases to know itself, God seems to be human and falls into the multiple personalities we know as human beings. Humankind is fallen God. The goal of Gnostic salvation, then, is to bring self-awareness back to God, which means that divine self-knowledge is the religious goal of human life.
Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there. Like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad.
Celine is a most awesome scholar, just as Bob is. As a bonus for members and patrons, I'll provide a trimorphic paranoia, where we'll be joined by another brilliant religious scholar as well, my friend Joanna Kuyawa. Joanna will discuss the show's topic and take the themes of sexual violence, female oppression, and integration to its Eastern and medieval aspects. You'll get more than 2 hours of Gnosis. The underworlds of suppressed memories and stolen dreams, as well as the night skies of ignorance, are unraveling. The treasure to heal personal and cosmic trauma within our grasp. Seems trauma and recovery have been main themes on this show this 2019. Oh, my beloved truth seekers. Maybe I need some healing and introspection. My past as a child is certainly filled with sexual violence, physical oppression, and nasty emotional engineering. And here I am serving you as together we adventure across the heavens of possibility, accompanied by those goddesses. Then again, the Gnostic stories are all about that healing from personal and cosmic trauma. As Tom Robbins said, it's never too late to have a happy childhood.
Mother is the name for God on the lips and hearts of all children.
What's more, and you are seeing, the Gnostic Gospels are just one accurate map of the human psyche. And we're just discovering, as Jung said, that no one knew the human psyche like the Gnostics. And as I've said, the Gnostic narratives, as gritty and visceral as they are some of the most positive stories you'll ever hear. From the victory of Eve to the leadership of Mary Magdalene, from Simon and Helen uniting in love to the poetic message of Christ and Hermes. It's all truly vesting content. I hope I have helped you see this, just as you helped me see this with your feedback and support. Let us do the first part of our interview with Celine Lillie on The Rape of Eve, while members and patrons get the full dope and also the galvanizing trimorphic paranoia with Joanna Kuyawa. Deeper we go, as we write our own gospel and live our own myth.
What are you?
Me? I am I. You were home.
Where are you taking me?
The beginning. It won't hurt much longer.
What hurts me the most is that it wasn't enough.
It's not your fault. Nothing is ever enough. I couldn't create if it was. And I have to. That's what I do. That's what I am. Now I must try it all again.
No. Just let me go.
I need one last thing.
I have nothing left to give.
Your love. Still there, isn't it?
Go ahead. Take it.
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we definitely have the pleasure of being joined by Celine Lillie to discuss her book, The Rape of Eve, the transformation of Roman ideology in 3 early Christian retellings of Genesis. How are you doing today, Celine?
I'm great, Miguel. Thanks so much for having me on the program.
The pleasure is truly ours. As we mentioned, this book really moved me. I think it's one of my favorite books on Gnosticism, or since, for example, David Brackey's The Gnostics or April DeConnick's The Gnostic New Age. This is up there. I think it's groundbreaking. It's empowering. It's spiritual. It's just a great book, and I'm very happy you wrote it. So thank you for that. And our audience will love it when they hear the message of it, because like I said, it may be called the Rape of Eve, but at the end, it's a very positive message for the ages.
Thanks so much, Miguel. I really, really appreciate it.
Oh, no, it was great. And we definitely want to unpack it. And with us, always great to have the Abraxas chicken wing man and the moondog himself. Vance, how are you doing today?
I'm okay, Miguel, and I'm looking forward to hearing all about Eve.
Oh, indeed, like you never have before. So why don't we start a little bit about yourself, Celine? Tell the audience a little bit about yourself and why you came to write The Rape of Eve.
So it's always interesting. I'm always curious how I'm going to tell this story. But I grew up in a pretty progressive Christian church and left Christianity to explore a myriad of different things as I entered my teenage years, as people are wont to do, and ended up in Boulder, Colorado, actually, and finishing up my degree at Naropa University here, and was really debating about kind of full-fledged becoming a Buddhist. Did I want to take refuge vows? Did I want to convert to Buddhism? And in the middle of this, 9/11 happened. And I started hearing all of this rhetoric in the news around Christianity and what it was and what it meant, and decided that I really needed to go back and explore the tradition of my birth for myself, and ended up kind of starting to learn about Christianity again, really through extra-canonical gospels, reading things like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, and ended up at Union Theological Seminary doing a Master's of Divinity, and really thought that I'd have to leave this extra-canonical stuff behind when I started studying Christianity for real, and I'll put that in for real in big scare quotes, and ended up with a New Testament professor, Hal Tausig, who was teaching the extra-canonical stuff right alongside the canonical gospels, and really looking at this wide range of early Christian literature. And very early on, I thought, if I could study this would be amazing. And ending up pursuing a PhD and working with him, and really asking, one of the things with particularly the Nag Hammadi library is that, because it kind of came out of this jar in the 40s, it's really been wrenched of a social context in particular ways. And the exciting thing about it is, because we don't have a 2,000-year interpretational history, there are a bunch of things that are possible, new ways of seeing that become possible when we look at these texts. But they've also really been spiritualized in particular ways that somehow I think we forget that, real human beings wrote and used and read and thought about and put together these texts all of these millennia ago. So I started asking kind of an intersectional group of questions about the texts, particularly about these myths of the retelling of the Adam and Eve story that form really the backbone of what people think Gnosticism is. And kind of asking this different set of questions really wandered into a new place in interpretation that I think will still bear out whether folks buy it or not, because it is so different from what I learned, what I was told, and what most people kind of read about these texts. And I caught the bug very early on in my career, and I've been working on this particular set of texts for, it seems like, close to 15 years at this point.
Wow. And of course, the texts are you talking about all the texts, or are you talking about the three ones, the secret book of John on the origins of the war and the hypostasis of the Archons, or the nature of the rulers?
Yes, those three in particular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when it comes to the creation stories and, like you said, the retelling of Genesis and all that, those are the three ones. And it's a great book for many reasons, but I always get the three stories confused. I'm like, okay, in this story, what happened in this story? Is the serpent bad or good in this story? But your book, you break it down. This is what happens. This is what happens. So it's a great book for that reason. Just again, to understand all the different stories.
Yeah, my hope was that it would really kind of give this opportunity to both look at similarities and differences and open up some new spaces for thinking about, what might these people have been thinking? What kind of work were they trying to do with these different stories, and where those similarities lie kind of start to show us some places where they might have been thinking about some of the same things as well.
Exactly. And I think we should, again, for the audience, bear with us, because the book is, it's disturbing. It is graphic. I mean, in some of the scenes, as Celine says, we're not just talking about the rape of Eve, but we're talking, it goes into graphic detail, like in the origins of the world. And it's a harsh book to read, but again, it takes you to some wonderful places, like a mystery religion almost. And we will get to that, but I guess we should start with understanding or defining the word rape itself. What context do you define rape?
So I was going to say, Miguel, and thanks so much for really kind of holding that up and holding it lightly, because this is it's a really difficult story. And especially with the advent of Me Too, I think we're at a moment in our own history as a culture where we're really becoming aware of how prevalent sexual violence is. And so for me, really, it is simply sexual violation, and simply is probably not quite the right word for that, but any of these moments where people aren't given autonomy over their own bodies and what is done with and to them. And in the ancient world, I guess there are two things that I want to say about this, is that in classics in particular, this idea of sexual violence was really kind of swept under the rug, and there were lots of scholars kind of saying this isn't the same thing, so we can't actually call it rape. And with the advent of second wave feminism, that started to change in scholarship, and folks started saying, we really need to. They might not have figured it in the same way, but this is still sexual violence, and we need to see it as such, partially because our contemporary Western society is predicated on these classical Western texts that form our canon. So this has kind of been a new movement, even to look at these, look at stories like this as sexual violence in contemporary scholarship. And as I said, in places that this was really swept under the rug. The other thing that I want to say is that, I worked on this for a really long time. And for me, at the end of the day, and I say this in the book too, that if there wasn't some kind of good news and some kind of potential for healing to come out of these texts, I don't actually think I could have worked on them for that long. So while they do depict this this very graphic sexual violence, and in some cases really gang rape, there is this moment toward healing that happens in the text as well, which is pretty amazing, and a real contrast to, I would probably call them the traditional interpretations of Eve that have been traditioned down to us.
God, I would say not even healing, Celine, because people talk about how these Sethians and these Gnostics are so emo, they're so dark and negative. But, and again, we'll break it down. But what I saw, and you write very well, this is not just about healing, because Eve ends up being the winner. The Archons basically sow their doom by doing this ghastly thing to her. Not only that, but she doesn't have to feel shame about what happened to her. She can have normal relationships. She can have great children. She can still thrive, and she can still be a spiritual savior even after all that damage. I mean, for ancient times or most of human history, for a woman to be able to completely, be able to heal and be fine and thrive and not feel shame at what happened to her, that's an incredible message 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing, and especially when you look at kind of what we talk about in contemporary culture around that, and especially with, and I'm sure we'll say more about this later as well, but with some of the ancient Roman narratives that you look at that deal with sexual violence. I mean, it really is all about shame. How much shame can we make folks feel around sexual violence that was actually perpetrated against them? That they had no role, obviously, in this, except for, feeling the shame and really being condemned to death. That was a huge, the attitude was, if you've experienced sexual violence, if sexual violence had been perpetrated upon you, especially as a woman, you might as well be dead. And these stories show something so entirely different, and this possibility of healing and flourishing, and pointing to also a real unmasking of these structures in society, and saying there is a different, we don't necessarily know what it looks like, but there is a different world that we can work toward and enact together, so far kind of removed. I think that was one of the most fascinating things to me about these stories as well, is that so many of these texts labeled as Gnostic have such a reputation for being so world hating and body hating and sex hating. And these texts really show a different story, that it's the structures of the world in certain ways and not the world itself that's the problem. And that embodied humans like Adam, like Eve, like Noria, like their children who remain unnamed in certain places, have the potential to really transform the material world.
Yeah, well said. And like you argue, Yaldabaoth, or as we call him on the show, Yaldi Baldi, he gets away with everything. He disobeys his mom. He is just screwing up the world. But trying to rape Eve, that's when he loses the plot. That's when things, that's when he seals his fate. So here's another interesting point, Celine, I think you'll find very interesting. Obviously, as you talk about in your book, rape is, sex without consent, and that's very important. And even now, as soon as I started reading your book last week, I don't know what social media places you go, but there is a big internet debate. And the debate is with neo-pagans versus Christians. And the neo-pagans are like, you know what? Mary never consented, so she was raped by God. And of course, you read the text and it says, well, Mary goes, well, I'm the handmaiden of God and I will do it. But have you had to deal with this issue too?
So what's really interesting is, there was a wonderful scholar who, I should note, but just passed away in the last 10 years. Jane Shaberg is her name, and she's done a lot of work on Mary Magdalene. Her work is very, very cool.
Yeah, she was on this show. It's one of my favorite books, The Resurrection of Mary Magdalene. It's one of my favorite ever.
Yeah, she was just such a wonderful, 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 wonderful scholar, and that's a great book for those of you who haven't read it. Go out and get that one too.
Immediately.
But she. Her dissertation work, and I cannot believe it'll probably come to me, in 15 minutes. The title of her book about Mary, Mary Jesus's mother, but talks about this tradition of her being raped by a Roman soldier, actually, and that this story of God being the father. Being a later construction. And we see these stories all the time of gods raping or sometimes having consensual sex with, although that's very, very rare, with human women and creating demigods. And so this is something that happens all over Greek and Roman mythology, especially Zeus. Jupiter is very, very famous for his liaisons, which really are rape narratives. And this has been kind of another area that classicists have debated about as far as these ancient stories, saying, you know, it was an honor to have sex with a god, and other folks saying, you know what, they're really rape narratives, and that's what's going on. And so there are, you know, very controversially, there are a lot of signs that point to, you know, we know that that the area was occupied at that point, and there's no telling, but this may be one of these ways to explain how Mary became pregnant. So this debate is actually not unheard of within Christian circles and scholarly New Testament circles as well.
So it will evolve. But again, my wife and I were talking about it, and she's like, no, she consented. And I'm like, well, you can't say no to a god. You'll get a thunderbolt. So I guess it's a good thing, like with these texts, that hopefully there'll be more dialogue. Again, people are debating this on the internet, and good things will come with it, some evolution in our society and so forth. But as you were mentioning, Celine, you talked about, obviously, as Zeus was, you might say, the Bill Clinton, Donald Trump of his days, of the gods. He was always out there. Many other gods were doing it, but the backdrop is really Rome. And you say that Rome, the history of Rome, is the history of rape. Tell us about this backdrop that frames these Gnostic texts.
So and before I forget to say this, the book is called The Illegitimacy of Jesus for folks who are interested.
There you go.
So, and this really comes from scholars who I was working with at Union, in particular the work of Davina Lopez, who was looking actually at Paul, the Apostle Paul, and a bunch of the Roman the myths of Rome's founding. And when I started seeing that, they're all rape narratives. The major moments in the founding of Rome are all rape narratives, from the birth of Romulus and Remus. Rhea Silvia, their mother, is gathering water for a ritual, and one of the stories says she falls asleep, and the god Mars comes to visit her, and to visit, again, we're going to use a really big scare quotes around this, and Romulus and Remus are born from this union. And even the texts that talk about this, so Livy, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, they, one of her, maybe let me back up a minute. So her family was kind of in line for the rulers of the pre-Roman people, and her uncle really wanted to usurp that line's power, and so he makes Rhea Silvia a Vestal Virgin. So these are the women that keep Rome's hearth fire, and their tenure as a Vestal Virgin is basically throughout their childbearing years. And later on in Rome's history, so anytime there was some kind of threat from the outside to Rome, something was going to penetrate Rome, they'd blame a Vestal Virgin. They'd declare her an adulterer, and they'd either throw her off the Tarpeian Rock to kill her, which is near the Capitoline Hill, or they bury them alive. And this supposedly happened on multiple occasions when Rome was under threat. So when Amulius, her uncle, found out that Rhea Silvia was pregnant, he actually condemned her to death in one of the stories because there was such this nervousness and taboo around the penetration of Vestal Virgins. And her kids were kind of put in a basket and thrown into the Tiber River, and eventually came to shore. So and were suckled by a she-wolf. Anybody who's been to Rome, you'll see the wolf all over the place with the two twins suckling at the wolf's teats, which is, it's ubiquitous if you go to Rome. The lupa, which is also a prostitute, which is really interesting. So kind of all of these sexual undertones with the story. And eventually Romulus kills Remus, and there are no more, they realize that, sorry about this. Romulus kills Remus, and Romulus gathers a lot of kind of criminal riffraff and pulls them together to create kind of the nascent city of Rome. But they realize that within a few generations, they're going to be dead because they don't have any women. So they go to the neighbors and actually ask for their daughter's hands in marriage, and their neighbors kind of say, no way we're giving our daughters to you. You've got to be kidding me. And so the Romans come up with this plot to get these women and create these games, and under the guise of hospitality, invite all the neighbors, offer them food and drink, offer them entertainment. And at the games in the circus, Romulus gives a signal, and they snatch all the women and bring them to their homes. And the story is known as the rape of the Sabine women. And this is which I thought was also fascinating, where we get the tradition of carrying women over the threshold after marriage into their homes. And this is to celebrate and commemorate the Sabine women who were taken against their will into the homes of the Romans. And that was just such a key moment for me, thinking about, gosh, these were stories that I didn't really know, and yet the traditions of them reverberate into the present day. And what did that mean? So those are kind of two of the stories. The other two stories happen later in Rome's history, and one is the story of Lucretia, who is married, and this wonderfully virtuous woman, and she's raped by the king's son, and she calls her husband and father in to let them know kind of what's happened, and they tell her that it's not the body that transgresses, but the mind. And so they kind of alleviate her of her suffering. And she basically says, I don't want anyone to think that they can't feel shame in my name, and takes a knife and kills herself. And this is paired with another story of a girl, Virginia, who is one of the leaders in Rome, becomes infatuated with her and creates this whole plot in order to basically take her as his own. And her father, rather than handing her over, takes her into the forum, and as they go by the butcher shop, grabs a knife and kills her, so that because it's better to be dead than shamed. So these are kind of these four really big moments at the beginning of Rome's history. And each one of them pivots around sexual violence. And it was just shocking to me to see this trajectory go through all of these different early narratives of how Rome came to be.
Yes, and like you say, this really defined Rome. I mean, basically rape was fine as long as it moved the country forward, but as long as it moved the fatherland, the male-dominated world. And then, of course, you mentioned all these stories, but you also talk about Ovid's Metamorphosis. And then you write that there are 50 instances of rape. Oh my God. And there's Jupiter and everything. But I guess, the main one, which does relate to these Gnostic texts, isn't it the story of, Apollo and Daphne?
Yes, Daphne and Apollo, where Daphne changes into the tree just like Eve does. And for a long time, scholars kind of wondered, this is a weird motif, Eve changing into this tree. And And then folks kind of realized, oh, wait, there's that story of Daphne and Apollo, and there are mosaics from the ancient world that depict this story. And they thought, what if this story has something to do with what's going on with Eve in these texts? And as you start to kind of pull back some of these political pieces, more and more, it seems like, yes, absolutely, Daphne and Apollo has a lot to do with what's going on with Eve, except for Daphne, the laurel tree, which becomes also the sign of victory for Rome, wearing those laurel leaves. She ends up kind of being stuck in this position and is rendered, which I just found also amazing. Daphne, who wanted to follow Apollo's sister Diana and be able to be, one of Diana's virgins that could really pursue the hunt, instead of being married. And this transformation into a tree, while Apollo isn't able to marry her, quote unquote, properly, it does render her usable for Apollo as he uses the laurel to adorn himself, to adorn his hair, to adorn his lyre, and as a sign of victory. So again, a really kind of fascinating story. But Eve, on the other hand, this is a route of escape for her, but it doesn't freeze her in a way. It doesn't render her usable. It actually helps propel her own the healing of her shadow material self, which is a really interesting twist on the story.
Celine, did the Greek story, do you think, feed into the later Gnostic stories, or in the Nag Hammadi, or do we know the order of the creation of those two myths?
So the Greek story, my guess, definitely fed into this, and Ovid particularly used the Greek story and turned it for his own purposes. I have a hunch, which I can't, which I don't know if I don't know if this is something that I'll ever really be able to figure out or not. But there's a really interesting book, and I'm going to blank on her name, but called Ovid's Ovidian Eve. And there's a whole chapter about how Milton in Paradise Lost frames Eve as Daphne from the Metamorphosis. And there are also several early church folks who are using Ovid in their to talk about both quote unquote pagan culture, so Roman culture, to talk about connections and disjunctions between kind of burgeoning Christianity at the time and Roman culture. And there are folks who are noticing similarities, because at the beginning of Ovid's Metamorphosis sounds a heck of a lot like the beginning of Genesis, including the way that humans are created. Prometheus is mentioned, but the story really unfolds in particular ways, starting with chaos and the separation of the earth from the waters. And right before the story of Daphne and Apollo, there's actually a flood that decimates the entire earth except for one pious couple. So there are all of these really interesting things that that kind of point to a longer term reading of Genesis and Ovid together. And I really do think kind of they pull in through that vein. Sorry, as I'm just kind of thinking in my head, I think one of the things that I found so interesting, so like On the Origin of the World, you also get the Eros and Psyche story at the kind of in the middle of that, as as the material world is kind of in this fecund proliferation from the blood. And I'm not going to be able to quote this directly, but there's this, it's just a wonderful story of kind of this overabundance of female fecundity in creating the world. And in the middle of this is the Eros and Psyche myth. So, one of the things about these folks is they are really using this myriad of resources to try and make sense of their world and the creativity that's going on. I think we're just kind of starting to really scratch the surface of the sophistication of what these folks were doing in these retellings of Genesis.
I would agree with you. Like you said, we've only just begun with these texts, and there's so much there. And I think Carl Jung was right when he said the Gnostics really knew the psyche, and it seems these texts are almost a map of the human mind and trauma and processes, like you said. And we definitely want to get to these, but we've hit on a lot of them. But let's talk about the three texts. Again, it's on the origin of the world, the reality of the rulers, and the secret book of John. Maybe could you tell the audience what are the similar themes in all of these?
So, for all of these texts, they're really retellings of the first 6-7 chapters of Genesis, and it's amazing how closely they follow that narrative plot of kind of this double creation of the earth. So, sometimes we forget this in Genesis, but we actually have 2 creation stories.
Right.
And that these 2 creations really happen in all of these texts, kind of in different points, depending on which text we're talking about. But, some kind of proliferation of this perfect divine realm, and something goes awry. There is a rupture, and usually this is connected with Sophia or wisdom, who somehow creates on her own. And I think there are kind of all kinds of complicated ways that this gets figured in the 3 texts in both similar and different ways. But one of the interesting things too is kind of Sophia creates this rupture and has a son, Yaldabaoth, who is a combination both of the divine because of his mother wisdom and the material, which is really created through him. And he just runs amok as the ruler of the world. And he thinks he is a god. He is arrogant and thinks he's in charge of everything. And a voice usually from the divine realm, as he's boasting about who he is, tells him that he's wrong. And these rulers or archons, normally, sometimes they all freak out, and sometimes it says that the text kind of talk about the lower rulers kind of making fun of Yaldabaoth, like, ha ha, he thinks he's so great, and look at this divine being. And what ends up happening is they get enamored with this being, and they're also jealous of it. They want this power. And so this is then where Adam comes into play. And so they create a human being really to try and seduce this voice and the face that they see on the waters, this female, and I use that loosely because so many of these beings are really androgynous. But to seduce, they create Adam to seduce it. And in several of the texts, what actually happens is, and I think particularly in Secret Revelation of John, Yaldabaoth actually is the one who breathes life into Adam. But what this does is it actually takes away his divine power and gives it to Adam, which is really interesting. And so in the Secret Book of John, then that power kind of hides inside and then is extracted and becomes Eve. So this is kind of where we get the side or the rib story that we find in Genesis. So that's kind of how that happens in both the secret book of John and Hypothesis of the Archons. On the origin of the world is a little different, and maybe I'll say something about that in a minute.
Sure.
Basically, what one of the things about Secret Book of John that I think is really fascinating is so he sees Eve talking. Yaldabaoth sees Eve talking to Adam, and this does happen in all three too, and gets jealous. And it's at this point that he rapes Eve. But the text in Secret Revelation of John is so interesting, where it says, this was the beginning of marital intercourse. That this rape actually was the beginning of marital intercourse, which is really, really fascinating. And not necessarily the case in the other two. In the other two, Eve actually, and in that one too, Eve is kind of snatched up and brought into the heavenly realms. And it's particularly in, although she is associated with the tree there as well. But in the other two texts, so on the origin of the world and reality of the rulers, that's where she actually changes into a tree. And in reality of the rulers, she gets implanted within Adam, and then, comes out of his side. But on the origin of the world, which is really interesting, Eve is actually really a creature of the divine realm, and is very closely associated with Sophia. And they actually see Adam. They keep trying to huff and puff on origin of the world, and they can't actually make him stand up. So these female divine women really feel they feel sorry for him, and really use him kind of on behalf of their own plan to counter the rulers. And they send Eve to breathe life into him. And then eventually, he I think it says he has a soul at that point, but he still couldn't stand. And Eve says, Adam, arise. And the text is so fascinating. It says her word became a work. So her word is actually efficacious. And Adam stands up and sees her and says, I will call you mother of the living, for you have given me life. Then, like in the other texts, the rulers get jealous of her, and they want to possess her. And they think the way that they can get her power is to rape her. So in both reality of the rulers and on origin, this is the point that the spiritual Eve kind of goes into and turns into the tree of knowledge, leaving her shadow behind. And the texts all say that, at this point, Eve is raped, and the shadow of her is raped, and that these rulers don't realize that they've actually harmed their own body. So in a way, they've harmed themselves with this despicable act of violence. And their whole plan is that the children kind of born from this rape will be subject to them. So they're creating, they're trying to create this society where they're in control of everyone, this totalitarian regime. And what ends up happening in reality of the rulers and on the origin of the world is that the serpent ends up being another creature from the divine realm, who's actually there to help. And when Adam and Eve are placed into the garden, comes along and comes to Eve and says, did they tell you not to eat from this tree? And she, of course, says yes. And the serpent says, they're lying. You will be able to, and I love this too in On Origin, you'll be able to tell the difference between evil humans and good. So it's really about kind of seeing through these machinations of the structures of society. And she eats, and she gives fruit to Adam. So this is from the tree that she became. So there's this ingesting of this thing that was split off in a really similar manner to kind of how we think about what trauma does to people and how the pain of trauma splits. And then one of the pieces in the process of healing is trying to figure out how to reintegrate these split off pieces. So Eve then eats this split off piece of herself, and Adam partakes of this too, which I think is such an interesting moment of even further healing, that he is somehow able to see this violence as well, and that this eating of the fruit unmasks these structures for him too. And they go on, Adam and Eve go on to love each other, and their children end up being the saviors of humanity in one way or another. A really different and interesting twist to the story in Genesis.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I mean, it's definitely a critique and rebellion against the patriarchal Roman society and everything that's ensued from those days. And it's definitely a beautiful, as you write it, a beautiful story where Eve and Adam become, well, Eve is first superior, but they share in the pain, they share in their adventures, they share in their ambition, and their children will overthrow. And it should be mentioned that, it's horrible because the Archons and Yaldabaoth, they gang rape her, they have sex with her over and over again because they are trying to populate the earth with slaves and keep her power down. And also psychologically, again, I love how you mentioned that Yaldabaoth, the first person he mates with, is the manifestation of madness. And that's very psychological. We get obsessed with one thought, and it starts driving us crazy, and we create these false worlds in ourselves. And that's the tragedy of Yaldabaoth. But with Eve also, isn't this classic, what you call disassociation?
Yes. So this real disassociative moment, but I just have to say, Miguel, I love what you're getting at here too, though, because this is one of the things that Yaldabaoth is so obsessed with his power, and God forbid he has to share it, that he ends up copulating with madness.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a really interesting way to look at this. And then you get someone, and this has been, another thing that I've been thinking about so much, I think more recently, again in the last couple years, about what a fantastic position Adam holds kind of in the middle of this too, where he embodies the masculine, and in the face of Eve's rape and dissociation and reintegration, he doesn't need to get defended. He can be her partner and not have to, it doesn't diminish him by lifting her up, which I also think is such an amazing contrast to what's going on with Yaldabaoth, who's so scared that somebody might see the cracks in his power, that he resorts to arrogance, violence, ignorance, all of these psychological constructs that we do see running rampant, not just in our society, not just in men, but in our society in all kinds of ways.
Oh yes, it truly is an inspiring story. Again, it gives a whole new view on Adam and Eve. And a little side question that I had as a scholar, I mean, the Archons, except for the Demiurge, they are presented as hermaphrodites or androgynous with beast forms and all that. So I always thought that's interesting, why they would be interested in a human person. Or, again, is this violence for the sake of violence at the end of the day?
Yeah. So, one of the things that I didn't spend a heck of a lot of time on in the book, but I think is another, it would be another really interesting, fruitful comparison, is the ways in which, and again, Ovid's Metamorphosis is so interesting, where you watch these gods turn into beasts in order to rape women. They just got, Zeus turns into, there's a story of Leda and the Swan, where he turns into a swan. He turns into a bull. I mean, there are all these really interesting places where people end up embodying these beastly categories, and that it's not always so much about being an animal per se, but of embodying these beastly qualities that are looked down upon. And so often in the ancient world, it was the barbarians who were tagged with these kind of amalgamous descriptions. And here it's the rulers of the world, which is really, really interesting. So again, another area where I think they're interested in human women, because so many of these beastly men are interested in human women in the stories.
Sense.
Yeah.
No, that makes sense. And also another important nuance, and maybe you could share with the audience, is the word to know. How is that important in the sense of Adam and Eve?
So there's always this ambiguity with knowledge and what it means to know, and the joke about, knowing biblically. And so it ends up becoming a euphemism for sex as well. So there's this real intersection of being able to see things and sexual knowledge of one another and what that means in the midst of this. And again, in all three texts, you do get this piece where Adam and Eve are embodying this knowledge. And one of the ways it manifests is through their sexual relationship and having children who will carry on their legacy.
Makes sense. Makes perfect sense. And as you write, at the end of the day, or many days, because it's so complex, and Eve has just so many new dimensions, as these authors found out 2,000 years ago. But as you say, Eve continually embodies and bridges the divine in the human realms, whether in her spiritual aspect or her material. So that's definitely a very important aspect about Eve.
Yeah, I mean, it's really this amazing. And, Karen King is kind of the original person who talked about that, human beings and she was talking about particularly in Secret Revelation of John, end up really embodying this place where they hold pieces of the divine and pieces of the material together. And Ovid actually talks about this when he talks about the creation of human beings as well, that humans are the only creatures, because of standing upright, that can look down to the ground and also look up and be able to worship the gods. And what happens, though, is Eve really becomes this mediator all the time between humans and the divine realm. And part of this is because of her connection with these female divine beings. And again, the place I think we see this the clearest is in On the Origin of the World, as she's really part of this constellation of Zoe, life, wisdom, Sophia, and becomes the tree of knowledge. And the serpent is also connected with these female deities in the divine realm. So they're really kind of aspects of one another, and always working with one another for the benefit of humanity. And Eve really becomes kind of the place where all of this gets connected. And there's something about this too, which I think is so interesting, is that she stabilizes that place. You look at what happens with Yaldabaoth, who doesn't know how to exercise that power correctly, and it's constantly in the service of death and enslavement and subjugation. And then you have this contrast of Eve, who's constantly using this power for helping and healing and wholeness. So it's just, again, these juxtapositions really get underneath the contrast. And I love this too, of thinking about, our own psyches and how they operate, and what these different characters, just like in a dream, show us, not only about kind of the big macrocosm of, thinking about the ancient world, but the way that we can kind of take them up today as well and think, what's going on here, and how does this mirror, how can I use this as a mirror for thinking about my own processes?
Oh, indeed. Yeah, very meditative. It sort of reminds me, I remember years ago, the great Bruce Chilton, who's been on the show, and I love his work. He'd read On the Origin of the World, and he's like, I think Sophia is hysterical. And I'm like, Bruce, that's not going to age well. Not in this day and age. But, again, Sophia, she is all over the place in this text. And again, these are processes of the mind in different stages. And what do you think of On the Origin of the World? I mean, this is a fascinating text. It seems very syncretic. You mentioned the sort of Hellenistic influence with Eros and Psyche. It's obviously got a Manichaean influence. Whenever there's something with Archons ejaculating and creating plants, you've got Mani somewhere in the background. It seems there's a lot going on. What have your studies told you about the origins and the process, and who had their hands on the origins of the world?
And so again, I would say, oh gosh, I mean, what a great question that is, and I don't have a great answer for it. It's one of those things.
Nobody does. It's still early.
It's too early, and I think that's one of the things about kind of the history of scholarship on these texts is that we've assumed, I think, too small of an influence pool. And so I think it's going to take, I think it's going to probably take several more generations to really get underneath all of the things that are going on and how they're using all of these influences. I mean, I think about, folks who've identified, like some of the Aramaic puns and things that are going on underneath the text with like Eve and the serpent. I mean, there's all this really interesting language stuff that I only have like 3.5 ancient languages, and it's not nearly enough to do some of the work that needs to be done. But, there are so many things that really just point, in my opinion, to these being really brilliant, multilingual folks who are so playful about engaging these very serious issues in the world around them and trying to make sense of it. And the vastness of the resources that they're using, I don't even really want to hazard a guess really what the possibilities are regarding that.
Yes, indeed. But we can pretty much say that with confidence that Secret Book of John was probably the first, hypostasis of the Archons later, and then On the Origins of the World is probably 3rd, 4th century. I mean, can we safely say that, Celine?
I don't know. And one of the so this has been, a really a question that I've been asking a lot, just in terms of, I guess, how does elaboration work? What's going on? What was originally there? What were they using? And so I don't know how much I want to hazard a guess with that. I have a hunch that there are some things that on Origin where I look at some of the Pauline things that it's picking up. I think there are some things with the Gospel of Mark that have been hiding out in there that we haven't really taken a full look at. The elaboration at the end that has, which is really interesting, kind of this it feels a lot like Revelation, kind of the end of the world that occurs at the end of On Origin. But we also get these really interesting resonances with the Book of Revelation in Secret Revelation of John, and I do talk about that a little bit in in the book, but I also think that they are, they're really coming up against some of the early church leaders like Tertullian, who are using stories like Lucretia, and which comes up saying, this is a good model for you Christian women. And coming up against things like First Timothy and women being silent. So a lot of them, I think, are playing with second century texts in certain ways. So I don't know. I never like to talk about final form because I think it's the way that scribal culture works. It's so hard to know, but I think, most of the seeds for this, are really happening in the second late second century to early third, and the question is just how elaborated are they? And I don't know. I don't know. And sometimes I wonder if that's the right question to ask. The only thing that I can really say is that Irenaeus seems to know a very similar story, and he's writing around 180. So something is going on before that that's fairly well elaborated that he is picking up.
Wonderful. Yeah, well, I know sometimes I like Stephen Davis in his great book on the Secret Book of John. He puts the Secret John early, very early. So I guess we shall continue. Yeah. We'll figure it out until somebody gets a time machine and so forth. But I think we have come to the end of this tale and this myth. So first of all, Vance, thanks for keeping us company and coming up with some great questions.
Oh, you're very welcome. I've learned a lot about the early origin text of Gnosticism. So I don't know, Miguel, we may have to call our show the that Eon Bite instead of Gnostic show,
Yeah. Biblical Demiurge's radio or something.
Yeah. I guess we better stick with Gnostic radio.
Yeah, it works right now. But these ideas are wonderful. Well, Celine, thank you so much. Again, I am so happy you wrote this book. I know our audience will like it. I hope they go out and purchase it because, like you said, we have only just begun, and your contribution is just wonderful, not for the field of Gnostic or biblical Demiurge's studies, but for just the field of humanity and history. You've done a great job, and I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. And Vance and Miguel, just thanks so much for having me today. It's been a real joy. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And there you have it, oh you spiritual entrepreneurs and tech theurgists. The first part of our interview with Celine Lillie, based on her book, The Rape of Eve. Get ready for more intensity and those hidden treasures to heal past and cosmic trauma. In our second part, Celine continues on her deep dive of the meaning of Eve in the 3 creation myths from the Gnostic Gospels. We cover as well other texts like the Book of Enoch and how they relate to the fury of the Demiurge and his angels. Celine continues with her psycho-spiritual deconstruction, of course, focusing more on the myth of Sophia in general. We cover the Gnostic Noria, arguably the most remarkable female figure in all of religion, as you will see. And we discuss broader Gnostic scholarship, like whether the term Gnosticism is useful at all, and much more. As mentioned in the intro, as a further bonus for members and patrons, I'll provide a trimorphic paranoia. We were joined by another brilliant religious scholar, my friend Joanna Kujawa. Joanna will discuss this show's topic and take the themes of sexual violence, female oppression, and integration to its Eastern and medieval aspects. More than 2 hours of healing Gnosis for ya. So please become a member or patron at Patreon for this important content, as well as to keep this Red Pill cafeteria open. I can't do this without you. As I mentioned in a recent show, 2018 was the best year for Aeon Byte, and the trend continues on this January, the year of our Demiurge 2019. Of the tens of thousands of you who listen every month, if only 10% joined, I could go full-time and increase 10 times the content I offer you, as well as upgrade production. Just putting it out there. And let's face it, either as a member or patron, every piece of content I put out comes out to less than $1. I put out 4 or 5 a month, and thus every month it's cheaper than you buying a chemically infused fast food burger or socially engineered Cineplex movie. That's how affordable Aeon Byte is, and I hope it's valuable in your journey of awakening. So please support if you can. For means, just go to, you got it, thegodabovegod.com, my homepage, and you'll see some killer bonuses as well. Or just contact me. We've only just begun. We've only just started bringing down those sexual predators that rule our universe. And we're getting closer to healing past and cosmic trauma. But we need to hurry, or the rulers of this age will find other ways to violate our minds and souls. Divided we stand, together we rise. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being yourself, your true self. Hello and goodbye as always.